Today we're going to be talking about distributor delivery costs and what you need to know before you sign distribution agreements if you're a filmmaker. And our guest is Steve Miller, who is CEO of Strategic Media, and he started his career working for distributors, handling the delivery of media and marketing content worldwide. And I think most filmmakers don't realize that when you sign a distribution agreement, you're actually signing a contract to give distributors what they need in order to deliver your film to buyers worldwide. And you're also signing an agreement to give them the marketing materials buyers need to see in order to buy your film. So that means that signing a distribution agreement can be extremely costly. Steve's going to talk about what distributors expect to see from filmmakers when they agree to distribute a film, and he's going to address how to budget the right amounts to meet those costs. So, Steve, do you want to talk for a few minutes about your background in distribution?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some institutional knowledge. And I had a very inauspicious debut in the business of distribution. I started working as a shipping clerk for $3 an hour in 1985, shipping Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, 25-pound tapes, all strapped together to various stations across the United States. Thank God that within a short period of time we had satellite delivery and we didn't have to do that as much, but that's how I started my career. I eventually worked my way up through the studio system. I worked at Lorimar Studios in the days of fantastic television, and they were bought by Warner Brothers, and I did international distribution for Warner Brothers TV as well. And then I began working at a post-production facility and ran the facility so that I learned all about post-production and delivery items. And then I began working for a distributor, and we built from the ground all the way up to the top a library of a couple of hundred films, and I did post-production on all of those and did distribution by creating the marketing and also finishing the film. So that's a little bit of my background. One of the most important things that a filmmaker can do is have really, really good information on what their distributor needs going into any potential deal. There are various different levels, but once you sign an agreement, you will have in place a list of delivery requirements, and whomever is fulfilling those delivery requirements needs to be on board as early as possible in order to address what the costs are going to be and what the materials are going to be ahead of time.
You're saying there's sort of like an ongoing relationship between your post-production folks and the distributor, right? Unless you magically know what kind of distribution agreement you're going to get in advance and what those delivery requirements are going to be, you're going to have to go back to your post-production team and say, okay, now we have distribution. These are the pieces that I need.
Well, any smart filmmaker is going to look at what they want to create and distribute and create a list ahead of time on all the things that they're going to need for fulfillment. And that depends on what target they have. If they're doing just an electronic distribution and they know that they're not going to do a massive theatrical release, then that's a whole different set of circumstances. Anybody who has a good delivery person or a post-production supervisor or a line producer who has experience, and you can go to post-production labs, and they have people who can help you with that as well, they will have a list of what they want to create ahead of time so that they know that their target will be satisfied with whatever materials they have. And that has to happen very early in the process. That when you're developing a film and you're budgeting for that, you have to, envision what your target distribution is and plan ahead.
So you're saying that if I'm a filmmaker and I'm producing a $500,000 film or $1 million film, that I need to be aware in advance sort of what my target distribution is going to be, because there's going to be production requirements and post-production requirements that have to be met in order to be able to create the materials that the post-production team needs in order to create the deliverables for the distributors, right? So in other words, I think we were talking a little bit previously. You said if somebody's going to be doing a theatrical release, then they have certain sound requirements that have to be met on the set, versus if they're doing an electronic release or a digital platform release onto things like Netflix and Hulu and so forth. They're not going to necessarily invest the same amount of time in collecting the same quality of sound. Is that correct?
Absolutely. If you're creating a $500,000 film and you know you're not doing a theatrical release worldwide, your audio requirements are certainly, vastly different than if you're doing a tent pole for summer release. And it's absolutely something that you have to address in advance and be realistic about. It's impossible if you don't record while you're making the film all the various tracks that you'll need for the international market. It's impossible to go back and separate the tracks that have already been recorded and married together and have those separately. And that's get into trouble. They say, "Oh wow, my film's been really successful in this particular distribution. Now I'm going to, expand it." And they go to expand their distribution so they can make more money, and they find that they don't have what they need.
So for example, when you talk about different tracks, so let's say somebody's creating like a $5 or a $10 million film, so that's likely to have a theatrical release, and in order for it to make its money back, it's going to have to go international. In that instance, you're talking about recording different tracks. Are you talking about the fact that you're going to need to put sort of the voices, the dialogue on the set on one track, and the special effects on another track, and the music on a third track? Like, what are the tracks that? Why is it different based upon the distribution mechanism? Is it because you're going to have to do different audio for the dialogue, or like why does it need to be different if you're doing digital cinema or digital release instead of like theatrical release or international release versus domestic release?
Well, that's a great question, Nancy. And the best answer that I can give is an example that I personally went through when I was dealing with the German market and also the French market, which is they require a separate M&E track, which is music and effects track. And they need that isolated because ultimately what they're going to do is they're going to take the script, which is also called a dialogue continuity script, and they're going to hire actors and they're going to dub in their own language. If they have English married to those tracks, they can't separate them out. They can't release the film in their own language, and that kills any deal. Whether or not they pay for the dubbing or you pay for the dubbing as part of the deal, that depends on what license agreement you sign. But that's the best example that I can give to you. It's simple to understand. It's for each territory to be able to manipulate your materials to best suit their sales.
So that means that when you're actually working to produce your film, you need to make sure that the line producer and other people who are working to budget the film understand what your distribution objectives are, so that they can make sure that the sound people and the post-production team and everybody is on board and capable of delivering on those expected requirements.
Yeah, the best thing that your delivery person can do, whomever they are, is to go to whatever post-production lab they're going to use and get advice from the people who actually are going to do the work, whether it's an audio studio or it's a video post-production lab or a digital lab, whatever it is. And they can say, well, here's the standard delivery requirements that we're used to fulfilling, or here's the tracks that you will need. You're going to need 16 tracks or 12 tracks or 8 tracks, and, stereo right, stereo left, all these specific things. All you have to do is call up, and if you're doing business with those people, they'll volunteer that information and be very helpful in terms of creating what you're going to need to fulfill those requirements.
If I came to them as a producer and I started talking about this particular requirements and I asked if they had post-production teams they particularly like to work with, would they share that kind of information?
They probably would, because it creates a bond that allows them to make money from your project, and people are always anxious to do that. As a producer, you hold the cards, and you certainly you don't need to always go and hire freelancers off Craigslist or anything like that. You can call the shots, and there are plenty of people who will give you their time and their advice, and it's just a matter of you doing your due diligence.
Mm-hmm. If you're working with a good lab, then they've probably delivered to people like Lionsgate or like Warner Brothers or whatever. In other words, they've delivered to a wide variety of distributors. Does the fact that you've used a specific lab make it more likely that you'll be able to pick up distribution because the distributor knows, okay, well, I know that you're going to be able to meet the delivery requirements because you use the lab that we like to use?
Well, not necessarily. The reputations that we have here for good labs doesn't really amount to dollars. I mean, if you're using labs that have like a deluxe or something like that, that people know, it doesn't hurt, but it's really not a selling point. And I understand that not everybody can go to a full-blown, famous lab to get their work done. However, who's ever in charge of fulfilling those delivery requirements certainly needs to have relationships in place and the experience that you're going to need from them in order to do something reputable. And if you're doing it down and dirty and you're going to risk, hiring people that are, winging it, then, you take a risk that you're not going to have what you need.
Is there a place where you would normally look for people? You mentioned not using Craigslist. Is there a place where you would look to find those kind of skilled professionals, or is it kind of is it just keep asking around until you find somebody who comes highly recommended from a source that you trust?
Well, one of the reasons that I started my company, Strategic Media, is because I had strategic alliances in place for a lot of different services that I needed. And I had relationships with labs and people who worked at those labs, salespeople, post-production supervisors, things like that. Not everybody has that, but I recommend that those relationships are created by people that you know and trust and not strangers. So if you get recommendations from people, that's always better than just kind of flying by the seat of your pants.
Mm-hmm. Or believing what happens to be on their website, because you never know without somebody who's recently worked with them and recently had good delivery from them. You're taking a risk that you're going to spend X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, and yet when you finally get to post production, you're going to end up with something you can't actually make your money back on because the post production isn't good enough to qualify for a good distribution. So,
well, you and I have always had laughs when we talked about people budgeting for their films. Mm-hmm. And when you go on Craigslist or certain other sites, you see people who have used all their money producing their films, and then they have no money left for finishing. And that's a critical mistake. It's like someone who wants to start a new company and they want to spend $50 on a logo as their icon, but they want it to be as iconic as Apple. You don't want your company represented by a $50 logo down and dirty, and you don't want to do that with your film either. I mean, it really, in the long run, will end up costing you more.
Something that has been talked about by a number of the producers and line producers and executive producers we've talked to is the danger in producing content, especially repeatedly, that is subpar. Because what happens is people, you're thinking, well, I think it's important to get stuff out there, and people are always saying, just do it. Just start making films, see how it goes, etc. And the only problem with that is you tend to get known for really substandard content. It makes it so when you want to do good content or better content based upon what you've known, people look at the entire body of your past work and say, this has never been good. So why would I trust you with more money, or why would I trust you to do bigger projects when nothing you've ever delivered has been good? And I think it's easiest to fail, even if you've got really great actors, and even if you've got a really great script. If the post-production is really bad, it's not going to matter, because you're not going to be able to see the film. You're not going to be able to see the film the filmmaker intended you to see. You're going to just see, what they actually managed to turn into media. So what you're turning out will follow you from place to place to place to place to place. Like the first film you do, you're going to be hearing about forever.
That's an excellent observation. I've been around long enough to see people just churn out films in order to build a library, because the more films you have, then the more equity you've got if you want to go and try to find funding. But you do get a reputation, and people will think that you're always going to be producing what you're producing at the time. And it gets to be dangerous to be pigeonholed. However, Some people say, "Hey, I'm making films. I'm building a library," and that's their goal and objective. So,
I also think there are mistakes that you can forgive a film that's like $200,000 or $500,000 that you're not going to be able to forgive a film that's $5 million or $10 million. I think, and when you're an independent filmmaker, not having a good post production gets to be pretty hard to forgive the higher the budget goes up. One of the things you mentioned earlier, let's say you have a film and it does really, really well, a platform release or whatever, but it turns out that you didn't do post production well enough or didn't do production well enough that you really can't take it international. Well, that is permanently limited the value of that particular film. Like you can't fix it because you'd have to go back and reshoot it. You know?
well, not only that, when you're approaching distributors at that point in time, there's always someone who needs content, but you're going to get a fraction of what you normally would get because they're just looking for, bulk to fulfill time slots as opposed to, getting a really nice license fee because, they're going to feature your film somehow. It's just product at that point.
A couple of other people we've had talk have said that you have to be aware that sometimes distributors see your film, they buy it, and it's because they need to deliver 1,000 films to a particular buyer in a given year. And so you're one of the 1,000 films, but it's basically a bulk sale. And they don't really care about your film particularly, but the problem is the amount that they're going to give you is going to be a few $100s or a few $1,000s. Whereas if you've delivered something really good, and it's something that's going to be very attractive to an audience, then you become a much more powerful purchase, and you get a lot more for your work this time, and it also makes it possible for you to do better work and get a larger budget next time.
Well, you're talking about standing out from the crowd and having people feel comfortable working with you again because you're not only reliable and consistent, but you are honorable and your work is something to anticipate rather than just throw into a bulk package.
Yeah, and I think that there's often a push to get distribution. It seems to be kind of like a holy grail for most filmmakers, but it's not always something that they prepare themselves to succeed at. So it's a very strange thing when you see people working really hard to get something or saying that they really want something. I want my film to get distribution. Well, if you really wanted that, I think maybe you would have thought about that in, development and then pre-production and then production and then post-production. Because that would be all of the times that you have to think about it in order to get good distribution. And in order to get a good distribution deal, it has to be from beginning to end.
Those who are most successful are the people who plan far ahead. So many people are focused on the development that they don't think about the actual end result. And by that I mean, if your development is going to pay off, it means that you have to deliver on what you're developing. And to deliver it and get paid, you have to do your due diligence just the same as you would in developing and pitching and getting your film funding. It's all part of the package. You can't slack on the back end, so to speak.
So another question I wanted to ask is, in order to get distribution, you're going to have to create a set of marketing materials that you present to distributors. And I wanted to ask you, is that something that you also need to be aware of from a cost standpoint during the development, pre-production, production, and post-production stages? Do people tend to underfund the development of the marketing materials they need in order to get distribution?
Well, absolutely. And a common mistake is that people don't realize that if they're creating quote-unquote temporary campaigns, they're going to have to revisit those costs and create permanent campaigns. And so they need to be flexible and create materials that actually can be universal so that they don't waste their money over and over again creating different materials in different stages. It's a very hard thing to do, especially when you don't have anything at all to present to a distributor. So you need to create something, and I understand that temporary things are necessary, but you need to keep those costs low because ultimately The real money needs to be spent on the final product of promotion.
As soon as you get funding, you should start planning to create the final documents that you'll actually be handing over, using to get final distribution, and also giving to the distributors in order to sell the film to buyers. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Oftentimes, what you need to do in order to create interest in your project is you need to have a sell sheet, which could be a temporary sell sheet. But those kind of things, I think, need to be what I call down and dirty. You don't need to print incredible glossy, embossed, things that are very fancy, because ultimately those aren't going to be the final things that you need for delivery, and you're spending money way up front when all you really need to do is convey to the buyer how they can sell your project. And when you don't have final materials, you need to be very careful to limit your exposure financially. You should be able to explain the project and the film to any potential buyer, but at the same time, if you don't have any real materials because the film hasn't been started yet, you need to be very careful to keep your costs down.
Right. Well, I've definitely seen that. I've seen people, handing me the one sheet that they did for their film, or the 3-page fold out brochure that they did, before the film had any on-set photographs or anything. And like they have a finished film, but I'm still looking at that same brochure, and I think it's because they spent so much on it. They don't want to reinvest in producing those things again.
Yeah, and ultimately distributors are going to need what they call final materials. And if those are pre-production materials, that's not going to fulfill your delivery requirements.
There's a line producer who sort of manages the money across the whole project. There's the UPM who manages stuff on set, and then there's the post-production manager. Is he usually the guy that has to know the delivery requirements, or is there another person that does that?
Well, it really depends on whether you're an independent or you're an actual company. I've served as vice president of distribution for a number of companies and done hundreds of films. So I was the person who was in the seat where I already knew what the company's delivery requirements were, and I had a set of relationships where the person who was in charge of production would come to me, and I'd be the liaison between any potential buyer and the producer and the production company. And you need to have someone who has that kind of ability and talent and relationships in place. If you don't, and you find someone who's an independent, then you need to be able to have someone who's reputable and that is trustworthy, and it's very key. And most people have to understand that going forward. If you're a first-timer, then you need to establish a relationship with someone who's been around for a long time.
It's not guaranteed that your post-production supervisor would necessarily have those skills, even if they've worked on projects of similar size, because they're in the independent film world and everybody's experience is going to be different.
Yeah, but when you're interviewing someone and you're thinking about hiring them, these are all questions that you need to ask up front. Do you have a list of delivery requirements for the last few films that you've worked on? Can you tell me about your experience and your relationships? Those are important questions to ask.
If they haven't worked with a lot of distributors, if they haven't ever actually done the delivery for a film that's going to get a theatrical release either here or abroad, then they don't know what the delivery requirements are, so they can't advise you what you need to know about during production. And they also may not be able to handle the delivery requirements or accurately budget for them.
And that's deadly. It's a common occurrence, and people also will be dishonest with you in order to get the job. But one of the things that you really can't slack on, if you're serious about making films, is investing in good people and spending that extra dime in that area, because that's really pivotal in what you end up producing, and that will pay you back. But you don't want to shortchange. Most people say, "Oh, I hired this guy because he gave me the best quote." That's not necessarily the way you want to work. Or I hired this woman because I knew that she worked on this one film. Well, one film doesn't make or break an experience. So these are things that are very important to do research and spend time on. and not just say, okay, I've got $100 to do this, so I'm just going to hire somebody who can do it for $100.
I definitely think it's true, and it's also often been my experience that if you get the right people at the top, you actually save money, and the reason is because they know what the actual costs are, and they've got existing relationships that you can draw on. So hiring really experienced people turns out to be a lot less expensive in terms of actual overall cost than working with people that appear to be cheaper because if you're paying somebody's costing you $50 an hour, but it's going to take them 10 times as long to do something. So it's kind of like, well, maybe we should go get the guy who costs like $100 an hour or $200 an hour because maybe we're not going to have to spend as much time doing it. You know.
That's the exact example. Absolutely.
Your company, Strategic Media, can you talk a little bit more about what it does? You actually don't do post production for films these days. Are you available to advise people that are need to get good advice on getting the right, hiring the right people or getting the right budgets together, or understanding what their delivery requirements are likely to be, or solving problems if they've got a distribution agreement and they're struggling to figure out how to fulfill the requirements quickly and cost effectively? Are you available to provide that kind of consulting, or is that something that your company does?
Well, I certainly, and as you know this to be true, have no problem giving people my time and giving them advice on the best way to go about finding the right people and staying within their budget. That's kind of what I do all the time. And I believe that if you treat people that way, that it comes back to you. My company doesn't do post-production. I'm not a lab. I've run a lab before. I do what I enjoy right now, which is marketing and creating materials, whether it's web or trailer or graphic materials, print, that allow people to promote their companies in the best light or their projects. And I chose that because it's something that I really love, because it's a creative process. The technical process isn't as exciting, but I do know it. And I'm certainly one of those people that will give anybody that wants it information on how to get the answers that they need. And I think that's really important. It's networking at its best, and I've been doing it for 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've certainly been incredibly helpful to me, and I think nobody's got a more interesting background, a more varied background in the the business end of film, which is to say the actual, I don't know, getting paid for film, like actually getting it to people who buy film, which I think is like one of the big gaps in the. I think there's a tremendous focus in the marketplace on the creative side and the production side, but not so much on the distribution side. But if you think about it, that's literally the audience. It's the direct connection to the audience that actually translates films into something that are a business rather than an art. And also getting the right distribution, getting the right materials for distribution is what makes it possible to be able to see the art that's in a film. I don't think Kubrick. I'm pretty sure that Kubrick was down at the lab watching every single frame.
That was me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was in charge of putting films together right from the 35 millimeter print and doing all the color correction and all the editing and all the audio, and stayed up many nights, all night long, going frame by frame.
Yeah, see, it's funny because I think that's got to be the hardest for me. That's like the hardest part of film. Post production has to actually be good. It can't just be fake. There's no room for error, really. So I admire you for being able to do that job, because it just seems like it would be so hard.
Well, I can tell you that I've been very fortunate in working with some great people. All the films that I've worked on have different sets of problems, and they're each unique, and they're like different children. However, if you're working with the same telecine operator and you're putting a film together and he's doing the color correction and he's going frame by frame or section by section, and he's done thousands, and he says, well, look at that, that face is too red, or those, you can't see that particular person's eyes unless I, lighten up the scene, or this is too dark, it'll never pass international inspection. Those things are invaluable, and I've been really lucky to work with people who say, oh, wow, that's out of sync by 3 frames. Well, the average person may not catch that, and it may fly. It may fly in some territories that aren't that strict, but when you get into people who are paying big money and they find those kind of errors, it's a problem. So I've been really lucky. I've found really good people to work with, and that's why I believe in strategic alliances, because you keep working with them, you send them lots of business, and they do a really good job.
I think you're right. I think that's exactly right. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us.
Well, I'm grateful for your efforts and allowing me to share my institutional knowledge.
Thanks, man.
Uh-huh.